And we're back. Time to wrap up. We've talked about Hyper-V, we've talked about virtual labs, we've talked about on-premises, we've talked about operating system deployment and different tools for image management. We haven't talked about one thing. We've mentioned it, but not in this context. We've talked about PowerShell, great tool. We haven't yet talked about?
That would be Microsoft Azure, the Azure public cloud. And this module is called Integrating Microsoft Azure. Let's look at our objectives. I want you to understand Azure. I have the unenviable position of attempting to explain Azure IaaS in a couple minutes. I'll do my best. I'm going to show you how to sign up for an Azure free trial. We'll review sources of service credit. We kind of did that already, so we'll just review that. And then how can you use Azure either exclusively for your certification practice lab success or extending your on-premises lab to the Azure cloud, a more complex scenario. Let's get into this. Understanding Azure. This is one of the Azure documentation graphics. And I think it's useful because it shows the constituent parts of an Azure virtual machine. And I hope that you'll not be surprised because the same four components that make up any server or desktop system, namely the processor, the memory, network, and storage, are the same for an Azure VM as they are for an on-premises VM, as they are for a hardware host like these Surface Books. So in the diagram, you see we have a collection of virtual machines. You can have as many as you want for your needs. Those are going to all be backed by one or more virtual hard disk files, exactly as we've been doing in the course all along, only here they're stored in an Azure storage account, or Azure recently integrated a new service called Managed Disks. But anyway, that's where the storage is. Your VMs are also going to be attached to a virtual network that allows them to resolve each other's DNS names. Potentially, that virtual network can be reachable from the internet as well. In fact, it's going to have to be accessible by the internet or you'd never be able to connect to your VMs. This is called Infrastructure as a Service, or IaaS. And normally, in a business context, you'd want to go for Azure-based VMs when you need full control over your workloads. In fact, I often say that when I'm advising a business, your first question is ordinarily, do I need virtual machines for my workload where you're responsible for the entire stack, from the registry and the file system, environment variables, all of this? Or would you be a better fit for, say, platform as a service, where Azure hosts almost everything about your workload, and you just focus on your code in the line of business application itself? That's another discussion for another time, though. How do we sign up for Azure? What's involved? What are points to ponder? Well, let's look at some options for an Azure subscription. We've already mentioned at the beginning of today's course, there's always a 1-month, $200 trial. That's a 30-day trial where you can spend $200 of service credit on any Azure service you want. Doesn't have to be only virtual machines. Note that that's a one-time trial. After you burn your trial for that Microsoft account, that's it. If you have MSDN or BizSpark, we've already talked about that. There's service credit. Pay-as-you-go is one of the two main ways to do an ongoing subscription with Azure. Pay-as-you-go means as you consume resources, you're consuming, well, you're building your monthly bill. And each monthly billing cycle is going to reflect exactly what you've used. And Azure is very transparent about showing you where your money's going, where you can make changes, tweaks here and there to optimize what's called your monthly spend. Then there's the enterprise assurance. Wait a minute. Pause. The enterprise agreement is what it is.
Yep.
Okay, let me do that last one again.
And software assurance.
And then there's the enterprise agreement, or EA. And this is an interesting way to do Azure. It's for businesses that want to be able to more accurately predict their spend over the longer haul. So here you're committing to a yearly monetary commitment, and you're paying up front. And you essentially burn down that amount through the year's credit. If you go beyond the yearly commitment, you can roll the excess into the next year in arrears if you want to. But it is use it or lose it, that if you decide to go for a certain spending level and don't reach that level, well, that would be a learning experience for the next year. Okay, in this first demo, there's 2 demos in this last module. I'm going to show you how to register for a free Azure trial, and I'll show you just briefly your way around the Azure portal. If you point your web browser to azure.com, you'll find yourself at the Azure public page, where there's a whole lot of useful information across the top navigation bar. In particular, I draw your attention to the documentation library, which is really good, and the pricing area that has a pricing calculator, actually. That's what I'm showing you right here, that makes it really easy to basically model your workflow. If you need virtual machines or websites, or if you're doing data analytics, you can build a quote, basically, and gives you a fairly accurate idea of what your service would cost if you deployed it in Azure. It'll give you an estimated monthly spend. But let's come back to azure.com, and you'll see we have a couple buttons here. There's Start Free and there's Free Account. And this is the entry point for, you guessed it, creating your free credit account, where it tells you here what I've basically been telling you, how it works. If we scroll down, it says Start Free, and that actually kicks off the registration process, as you'll see in just a minute. Now what it's doing here is detecting whether I'm logged in on this browser session with a Microsoft account. If you don't have a Microsoft account, you'll be prompted to create one. If you have one and it's current in your session, it'll auto-load that. Mine actually is auto-loading. And this is probably, yep, I knew it would bomb out because I've already used the free credit with my Microsoft account. So it tells us that the free trial is not available here in this case, and we can either sign up for another offer and view our existing subscription details. Now, if I were using a fresh Microsoft account, it would ask us for, I think, 3 categories of information. There's your contact info, there's your email or cell phone that's going to do a verification on calling your cell phone to make sure you are who you say you are, and you'll be asked, actually required, to put in a credit card number. That can't be a prepaid card. It has to be an honest-to-goodness credit card. And the reason why they use it is strictly for authentication and basically to demonstrate that you are someone genuinely interested in the service and not a malicious script or robot, you see. So once you've filled the form out, you'll see some things turning. You'll see some things happening on the screen, and you'll be taken into what you see on the screen now, the Azure portal at portal.azure.com. And this is an HTML5 console that's got drag and drop. It's pretty easy to get around. You see on the left side, you have a list of services. There are so many services in here, but the main one that we're concerned with, of course, is virtual machines right here. There's a global navigation up on top where you can simply click the magnifying glass, start to type, like virtual machines, and it'll take you directly there. Now actually, you'll see that the drop-down says Virtual Machines Classic. Without getting too off track here, it's important to mention that Azure has 2 deployment models. The one that you should definitely focus on exclusively, unless you have a compelling reason not to, is the one you're seeing here at portal.azure.com. This uses a deployment model called Resource Manager. Some call it Azure V2. The classic deployment, which has the technical name Azure Service Management, uses a different portal and a different URL, and it uses a light blue theme. You may have seen screenshots or YouTube videos of it in the past, but it's still around for environments that have systems that are reliant upon it. But if you're just getting into Azure, you should be in Resource Manager, as you see here. Okay? So I guess that's it for this first demo. Let's go to the second half of this module. How can we start to use Azure for our IT certification practice lab? Well, this is a nice piece of documentation. I give you the attribution URL in the lower left corner. It's from the Azure documentation that shows you the parts and pieces of an Azure virtual machine. Again, don't want to get too much in the weeds here. But the resource manager, the word resource is key here because each part of a virtual machine is part of a set of components called resource providers. And in the storage resource provider, this is where your storage goes, your operating system virtual disk, your data virtual disks. The compute resource provider is where your actual virtual machines are stored. And you can do load balancing. You can create armies of virtual machines called scale sets if you need to do a lot of heavy lifting, if you do monthly batch jobs that require a lot of compute power. But that's getting beyond our simple case in an IT certification lab scenario. But you still need to know what these components are no matter how simple or complex your environment is. The network resource provider is what can hang people up because if you're not strong with TCP/IP networking, it's easy to miss some pieces here. In Azure, each VM will have a separate VNIC. We've already seen that in on-premises Hyper-V. It shouldn't come as a surprise. The virtual network interface is in turn attached to a virtual network. The virtual network can consist of one or more subnets. Again, if you're familiar with TCP/IP internetworking, it's the same idea up in the Azure cloud, but you don't have the hardware in front of you. I guess you just imagine it. That's part of the cloud metaphor after all. And then to get out onto the internet, you optionally can use a load balancer. And each VM has a software firewall called a network security group, or NSG, that's important to lock down to make sure that you don't open your VM to connections that you don't want. So there are definitely some operational hazards or considerations to keep in mind. With that, the second and final demo of the course is deploying an Azure VM just to see the general workflow. So let's take care of that, and then we will be done. Giving you a lot of information over the last 3.5, 4 hours. Here we are back at the Azure portal, portal.azure.com. I'm logged in with my Microsoft account. By the way, when you do this, when you sign up for a free trial and log into an Azure instance, you are the super user account. Azure has an identity management system called Azure Active Directory to where you can create additional administrators or even end users if you want to. Let me come down to virtual machines. I thought I just saw it here. There it is. And that'll load up what's called a blade. You'll notice that you can pin blades, you can close them using the controls, and of course we can click Add to start the VM creation process. This opens something called the Azure Marketplace. You'll recall that Christopher mentioned a few hours ago that you can save yourself time by deploying Azure VMs that have pre-loaded software. For instance, you see Windows Server, there's Linux distributions. I mentioned scale sets earlier. There's a template for that. There's third-party partners. There's a lot that you can get in here and kick the tires with.
Look up SharePoint.
SharePoint, okay. So in the search filter, I'm going to do a search for SharePoint. And we see
that HA farm?
There you
Click
go.
on that one. This is a great example of the real power of deployment in Azure and the description of that. This is a multi-server template.
Yeah, it tells us here, the text is probably too small for you to see on your screen, but let me read just a sentence here. It says that this template deploys a SharePoint Server 2013 3-tier farm topology, including Active Directory domain services and SQL Server in a high availability configuration with 9 servers and 29 cores.
Yep.
Whoa.
That is one template.
A single template. Wow. That's a little too intense for us.
It is
right
pretty
now.
intense, yeah, and you're probably not going to dive right into that as you're, especially if you're getting into, just getting into Microsoft certification exam prep. But this is just a great example of what Azure can do. Not only what Azure can do out of the box, but what you can build once you get experience with this, once you've gotten some certifications under your belt, and you're familiar with Azure, you're familiar with the technologies, start building your own ARM templates. You can start pre-building, we talked about lab reuse.
Right.
You could start pre-building ARM templates that you can just deploy armies of servers out into Azure for whatever uses you need, whether in the enterprise and production or in development or test or for the sake of exam prep.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the ARM template, ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager. And it's one of the great benefits of the Azure V2 model, the Resource Manager, as opposed to the previous one. The original Azure, everything was deployed serially. But with Resource Manager, you can do these parallel deployments that are just so powerful, as we saw. But in this case, in this simple example, I'm going to choose a Windows Server 2016 data center template. And we'll give it a click, and I'll just click Create here. And it'll open up a 4-step wizard where we're asked just a number of questions. Again, we're doing this manually.
Which, ironically, is more steps than an on-premises Windows Server install.
That's a useful piece of trivia to hang on to.
At least from 0 to logging in.
Yeah.
When it's on premises, it's insert,
Good point.
basically next,
Yeah.
and it installs. And you pick an admin password.
Mhm.
This is actually, hilariously, a slightly more intense process, although not intense by any measure. I still remember the NT4 and even Windows 2000, 2003, like RAID driver disk requirements if you were installing on a mirror.
Yeah.
Oh, the good old days.
There were 3 1.44 megabyte floppy boot disks that you needed to kick off the installation.
Or 4 for 2000.
Yeah. Okay. Now back to basics here. We have to give a name for the VM, a unique name. I'll call this, why don't we call it MVA Serve 010. Press Tab, and if it passes validation, you see a check. I'll leave the default storage. You can do solid state or old school mechanical storage. The SSD is going to be a little more expensive, of course. For the username, this is the default administrator. And Azure won't let you choose administrator for this for good reason. You don't want to use known defaults as a security hazard. You also have to have a strong password. The subscription that you want to attach it to is my current one. That's fine. You organize your Azure resources into resource groups. I'll call this MVA1. And that makes it really nice to keep your stuff organized. The location, Azure is spread throughout the entire world. You choose presumably a region that's closest to you and or your users to reduce latency. If that step passes muster, you're asked to choose a size. Now, whereas on-prem, if you need to provision a new server, how long does it take to get the approval? How much research do you need to do to spec out a server? How long does it take to order the server, receive it, unbox it, vet it, kit it, stack it, Here we simply see a nice menu of different virtual machine instance sizes. Now each one is going to have a different per minute runtime. You'll see my resolution's a little too low to show the whole thing. But you see here we have the recommended. There's a whole lot more than these 3 sizes that you see here. But depending on whether your workload is optimized more for compute or for graphics crunching, you can emphasize RAM or emphasize CPU or emphasize IOPS, the input-output operations per second in storage. And you'll pay per minute that those VMs are running. And those are the estimated values based on your having the VM online 24/7. I'm going to choose DS1 V2 Standard. And the third step is normally what hangs a lot of newcomers up, because this is where you do your networking and your storage. You can do the traditional storage account or managed disks. I'm going to do managed disks to let Azure take care of all the storage backend complexity. The networking, the way the templates work here, is that if I just click OK, Azure's going to deploy a new virtual network. It's going to create a subnet for me. It's going to give me the virtual machine, a dynamic public IPv4 address that I'll connect to, and it'll deploy a new software firewall called MVA Serve 010-NSG. Now you can override any of these choices, and in a real world you may already have a virtual network created, in which case you would select it and point to the VNet that you've created. Here we have no choice but to create a new one, because this is an empty Azure subscription at this point. But you see, the virtual net consists of an address space and 1 or more subnetworks. You can have as many subnets as you need. I'm just using the 1 in this template. I'm going to click the NSG or the firewall just for a moment, because it's super important that you actually look at the settings and verify them. For Windows Server templates, Azure will do an allowance for TCP port 3389. You may know that this is the remote desktop or RDP port. Pause. You might recognize this port as the RDP or remote desktop protocol port. You can add additional inbound rules. You can even specify which IP addresses the VM can communicate back to. Again, it's better to be secure here because these are cloud-based VMs that potentially can be accessed by people you don't want them near, basically. Extensions, high availability, monitoring options. We don't have the time or scope or need to get into that right now. I'm going to leave those at the default and click OK. And ultimately, at the end of this process, we have Azure doing a validation to make sure that everything we've selected works together, and then to click OK to submit the VM deployment. Now check this out. There's a link called Download Template and Parameters here. Chris mentioned the Azure Resource Manager templates. Anything you do in Azure behind the scenes has a couple configuration files that define exactly what happened in the deployment. You can download this to your system, tweak it, and then redeploy as many times as you ever want to.
I was going to ask what kind of scripts those are, but you're about to give it away by.
Yeah, it comes down as a zip archive, but if you open it up, you'll see that there's a template file and a parameters file that have the JSON extension. These are plain text files. JSON, you might know, stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it's meant to be an easy to understand data representation format. I'm trying to force it open in Internet Explorer. I think it's going to get there. No, it's not liking it. You can open it up in Visual Studio Code or
Notepad should work.
Notepad, yeah. Let me right-click. Actually, let me...
Oh, you're inside the zip.
Oh, right. Thank you. Okay. Let me, one step back here. Let me minimize everything. I'm actually going to grab everything and bring it out onto my desktop. There we go. And if I find the original JSON file.
I want to open in VS Code, those last two.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to right-click template.json and open with code. And it's just key value pairs, basically. And once you get the hang of how these ARM templates are constructed, you begin, it reminds me a little bit of working with a Lego set or an Erector set or Lincoln Logs. I'm thinking of childhood things that I used to build with. You can do a lot of cool things with these ARM templates. And when you download it, there are actually deployment scripts included as well, like this deploy.ps1. I'm going to open this with code. This actually is a full-fledged function that's personalized for this template where you pretty much can just run the script to deploy. Minimal tweaking needed. So I hope that this has given you some excitement at the power that's available in Azure for us, not only as IT certification candidates, but just IT professionals or developers in general. This is where it's at in terms of the Azure Public Cloud. To wrap this demo up into a bow, so to speak, I'm going to click OK to actually submit the deployment. At the end of this process, what we're going to have, let me go back to virtual machines, may take a moment for it to actually show up. But what we'll be able to do is click the VM and open up an RDP connection and start managing it exactly as you would any other remote machine in your network. For all intents and purposes, that cloud-based VM that's running out of an Azure data center somewhere in your geographic region will behave exactly as a machine that's on your own computer as a Hyper-V VM.
Yep. The power of Azure kind of plays back to our conversation about Hyper-V and how it seems deceptively simple.
Yeah. And speaking of deceptively simple, but wait, there's more. One final little coda here called developing a hybrid cloud. And the idea here is, and this is a very marketable skill, believe me, because many businesses have so much money, time, and effort invested in an on-premises presence. They know they need the Azure Public Cloud. They're not sure quite how to get there. Wouldn't it be nice, they think, if we could link some or all of our on-premises resources transparently into the Azure cloud to begin sharing and consuming services? Well, that's eminently possible. And this is the final Visio diagram that you'll have to look at for now, unless you rewatch the videos. And what it's showing at left is an on-premises network that has a server. Let's just imagine it's an on-premises site with an Active Directory domain. It has a local network that uses a private IP range, 172.16.1, and it's routed out onto the internet. Up in the Azure cloud, we have an Azure subscription and a virtual network that uses a different network ID, 192.168.0/16. And we have VMs running inside a subnet. We've got the NSG providing protection. And then we have all these middle components. What these are, that you're looking at now, with the exception of the router and the internet cloud, are Azure components that you define in your subscription. The local gateway is an Azure object that basically tells Azure about your local network. And in your local network, you're going to have to make some minor configurations to your own VPN device to point it to Azure. And you're going to basically point your on-premises VPN to the Azure VPN gateway that you see on the right side of the diagram.
This particular process is an adventure.
Yeah, this is considered an advanced concept, but I'm proud of Microsoft and the Azure development teams on how easy they've made it compared to how it was, say, a few years ago.
And I can attest to the documentation being great.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I did this in Azure, having never done it before and not having trained or looked at anything before, I went in just to try it, see if it would work, see how easy it was. Took me half an hour, 45 minutes.
Right.
Which seems like a long time to set up a point-to-point VPN if you've done it 100 times like I had. But once you've done it once, you know the process.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And your on-premises network can be your test lab. You see what I'm saying? Now, you're going to need to connect your test lab to the internet, as we've previously discussed, but this is something you can absolutely do in your IT certification lab. And Christopher mentioned the site-to-site VPN is a secure tunnel between your on-premises network and a virtual network in the Azure cloud. And that means, for instance, you can deploy a cloud VM and have it join your local Active Directory domain or vice versa.
So what I was testing, and I never actually went to fruition with this because I was just testing the concept. I put an Exchange server in Azure on a VM with my DC still on my on-premises local domain. And this is from my house. This is not high-speed connectivity. I mean, it is relative to what high-speed used to be. It's very high-speed connectivity, but it's just standard home internet. It's business class, but it's a home provider. And but I was getting connectivity from my Exchange server in the cloud to my Azure domain controller. It wasn't the greatest, but it did work.
Yeah, it's really a seamless extension. So when you hear the marketing term extending your on-premises environment to the cloud, that's exactly what it is. And so for use cases like disaster recovery, whereas a business may previously have had to invest who knows how much money with a physical disaster recovery site.
Yeah, colos and your own data centers you have to build. It can be cumbersome.
In Azure, there's a service called Azure Site Recovery to where you can fail over and fail back with a line of code. I mean, times they are a-changing. Let's just summarize it that way.
They are.
So with that, what have we learned in this final module? Well, we've learned that hopefully a lot. And we thank you so much for joining us today. That's really the main point.
Well, I was going to say we have learned a lot. We don't want to cover it all in one slide. So hopefully you've learned something useful. Hopefully you're going to start building. Hopefully we've given you information to get started on both the labs and exams.
Right.
Again, we've got the Mastering Certification Exam Prep course that you should go through before or after this one. There aren't prerequisites necessarily. They do go well together. And I'm hoping, as I mentioned, that this kicks off I can never remember the name. I don't know why. Autolab. I will remember that one of these days. We're going to kick off. We'll probably have a conversation right now about setting up an Autolab course and getting that recorded and getting it in here for the sake of some real-world examples of the technology that we've made available for you to make certification exam prep and testing and hopefully passing much easier.
Right.
If you have questions, let us know. There are multiple ways. I don't think I actually put my contact information in my lower thirds or on a slide.
Yeah, that's right. I put mine on here. You can reach me via Twitter. My handle is TechTrainerTim. Email, I figure my blog would probably be the most straightforward place to go. AzureDepot.com/contact. There's a very fast and efficient contact form there.
My Twitter, Christopher@MS. Or my email, ChristopherMVA@Microsoft.com. And we love feedback, so let us know.
Please do.
Otherwise, thanks, I guess. Thanks for coming. Thanks for watching. And actually what I've been doing, I don't know if I've been sending you, we haven't got a lot of feedback yet on the Mastering Prep, but we tend to get feedback on specific courses a lot of the times. And if it comes to me, I will make sure Tim gets it. We love getting that feedback. Not necessarily about the content, but even if the content's helping you. If you go watch these courses and then go take and pass an exam, let us know.